Hello, BookTube, and welcome to your Daily Penguin. This is my book-by-book tour of my Penguin Classic wall, and we are in the ancient world. We are looking at the classics of ancient Greece and Rome, probably for a while yet, as we work our way from left to right. And today we get to a big author, uh, the author of my favorite book, of the single book in all the world that I love the most. This is the Roman poet Ovid. And this is the Penguin Classic of the Metamorphoses. Isn't that beautiful? This is the David Rayburn translation in verse of Ovid's Metamorphoses. Now, the Metamorphoses is a long and daring poem. No, I've never read an English language translation that did it complete justice, but I've read a lot of great English language translations. It's a poem about transformation, and it itself transforms many times. And the narrative embeds stories within stories within stories, and then works its way back out in concentric circles, so that it's a daunting task for a translator to do. And I confess, I've always kind of hoped, I always hope for the perfect confluence of events. Penguin Classics is my favorite classics reprint house. I always hope for the perfect confluence of events that will make them use for their edition of a work my favorite edition of that work. It doesn't always happen. It's almost never true. And my favorite English language translation of the Metamorphoses is by Horace Gregory from 60 years ago. But I also love the Golding translation, even though that's much older, much, much, much older. And I like Alan Mandelbaum's translation quite a bit. I would say that the Mandelbaum and the Gregory I probably like more than this one. But this one is still perfectly fine, and it's got a great introduction and great notes. And it's a lovely thing. It's actually a lovely volume. It's not. It doesn't have the bane of our existence, a Roman fresco, a poorly focused Roman fresco as a cover illustration. Instead, it has a picture of a young woman being turned into a tree. And this was something that Ovid noticed in the myths that Rome had expropriated wholesale from the Greeks, which is that there's this motif of people being transformed into different things, stars or flowers or spiders or trees. And Ovid thought it was fascinating and decided to sort of do a weird kind of sensuous epic poem about transformation. And the last transformation that he talks about at the end of the book is when he predicts that this poem will make him transform himself. It will turn him into an immortal, and he was absolutely right. And I shouldn't. I like the Rayburn translation very much, and I love this edition. And it stands in stark contrast to the previous Metamorphoses by Penguin Classic, which is by Mary Innes. It's this thing. Here we have the stereotypical boring cover, and also the stereotypical Penguin Classic decision, which until recently was standard for them, which is to take an ancient work of verse and translate it in prose, sentences and paragraphs. And I remember for a long time I was a format purist and thought I just condemned those things out of hand. Then I tried a few of them. Of course, Penguin Classics started with a mega success, a huge bestseller. Doesn't usually happen with most publishing imprints at all. They don't start with the thing that makes them. They don't start with a great bestseller. But Penguin Classics did, and they started with a translation of Homer into prose. And it was hugely popular, not just because the Penguin Classics strategy was to make it cheap and make it available everywhere, not just in bookstores on the high street, but on train platforms. Not just because of that, but also because it was in prose. So normal people who had not had a classical education or who were intimidated by verse could pick up Homer's Iliad or Homer's Odyssey and read it for its story and not so much care about the metrics. And at first I thought that was a decision worthy of scorn, that it was actually at heart a condescending decision, until I read really studied some of those early prose translations of Homer, and there's an enormous amount of rhythmical stuff going on there. To say that those prose translations remove all of the poetic beauty of the original just because they're not in verse is dead wrong. You can find it buried in those lines everywhere. And that upped my appreciation. So I no longer scorn a prose version of the Odyssey or of the Metamorphoses, but nevertheless, I still have this. I like the introduction. I also find the prose here very interesting. It's not as far away from what you would think. It's not as far away from the resonances of verse as you would think. So I kept them both. I kept both Metamorphoses. And the Metamorphoses was a gigantic work, but it was not the thing that shot Ovid to success. He shot to success on the strength of his love poetry. And he followed that up with other things as well, including this thing, the Heroides, which is, this is also a Penguin classic. This is translated by Harold Isbell, and this is a sequence of very entertaining, almost historical fiction. Vignettes set into the mouths of famous women in history and in fable and myth. Very, very entertaining stuff. And thought-provoking. Very thought-provoking. And again, a fantastic introduction, fantastic notes. You'll notice that these Penguin classics that I have of Ovid do not include the love poetry. I was looking at my Penguin. One of the things I'm learning about this Daily Penguin thing is how many Penguins I don't have, which is shameful. I should have them all, and especially one of my favorite authors. But I do not have, in mass market paperback or in these trade size, I do not have any of the Penguin Classic love poems of Ovid. I know there's got to be a volume out there. I'll have to look for it at the bookstore and see if I can find it. I do have one other Penguin Classic, though, and it's incredibly sad. It's an incredibly sad book, and it comes from the story of Ovid's life. Ovid was a hit. He was a star. He was a best-selling author because of his love poetry. No one could get enough of his Handbook of Love. No one could get enough of the Arts of Love. People, again, they put it to song. They quoted it in ostler shops and barber shops. It was an absolute hit for the bookshop where it originally appeared, and for Ovid. He was the toast of the town, and he continued on with that. Continued on with other works, and also with slowly building the Metamorphoses, and it became more and more prominent as he did that. Got more and more high-profile fans. And then disaster struck. He was exiled by the Emperor Augustus in the year 8, in 88, Anno Dominum 8, to Tomus on the shores of the Black Sea, as far away from the sophistication and ease of the capital of Rome as you could get and still be alive. And to this day, 2,000 years later, we don't know why. We don't know why Ovid was exiled. He tells us himself he clearly didn't want to go into specifics because he spent the rest of his life on the shores of the Black Sea hoping to be recalled to Rome. So of course he wasn't going to spill any beans or get any or write any specifics that might get him in even more trouble. But from him we know that he was exiled for, as he puts it, something he saw and something he said. We don't have any more details than that. Speculation has been rife for 2,000 years. But Augustus died without recalling him. Augustus used to go to literary events, literary readings of all kinds, and had lots of literary friends. And they would constantly bring it up to him. He was a sole dictator, but he was not one of those sole dictators that require toadies to watch their tongue. His friends, he valued the kind of rustic idea of him being just an ordinary citizen, so his friends were perfectly free to bring up subjects they knew would anger him. And they did. They brought up Ovid quite a bit. And he didn't relent. He went to his deathbed without recalling Ovid. And a lot of Ovid's literary friends in Rome thought, well, that was a long time, and that's a rough way to live with hard-handed fisher folk who don't even speak Latin. But at least now it's over. But no, whatever it was bad enough so that Augustus' successor, Tiberius, would not rescind that exile. He also was asked many times, and he was the type who didn't like people bringing up unpleasant subjects on which his mind was made up. Why his mind was that made up, we don't know. But from exile, Ovid wrote. He continued to write, and he wrote an absolutely gorgeous sequence of letters from exile and sent them by couriers to his many, many literary followers, fans, and hangers-on in Rome. Those songs achieved something like the same, what we would now call viral status, as all of his earlier poems did. Imagine how embarrassing that was for Augustus Caesar and then Tiberius. Imagine how embarrassing that was. The people were still everywhere quoting and talking about the latest from Ovid, even though he wasn't around. He was in exile thanks to them. And that's the other Penguin book that I have. We have all of this stuff. The one thing that we might not have from Ovid is there's always been an extant rumor that to beguile himself, and because he was an endlessly creative person, a compulsively creative person, the rumor has always been that he learned the language of of uh, of his exile. He learned the language of his neighbors and his hosts, and wrote an epic in that language. Now, I don't believe that ever happened, but if it did, it's exactly the sort of thing he would have done. That he would have learned this new language, and his first thought would have been, what are its poetic potentials? I don't believe that it ever happened, but nevertheless, if it didn't, then we have everything that Ovid wrote, minus correspondence. And so we have a Penguin classic of the poems from Exile, with a suitably somber cover. This is translated by the great classicist Peter Green, and it's really, really good. Peter Green is fantastic at this sort of thing. Of course, the critical notes are beyond compare. They're amazingly good. It's very, very sad, though. These things were written in an unbearable combination of loneliness and a tiny, torturing sliver of hope. Ovid, I don't think, ever gave up hope, even after Tiberius refused, initially, to recall him. I don't think he ever gave up hope that recall would eventually happen. And it never did. And that is shot through in these. Now, there are a couple of other really good translations of the poems from Exile. And I have had trade paperbacks of some of those. I don't think I do anymore. I think it'd be fresh on my mind because we just did my library tour. I think I would have remembered that. So this may be the only one that I have. I'll again have to look around. I want to make sure, though, thanks to this Penguin library tour, I want to make sure that I have all of the Ovid that Penguin Classics offers, or certainly all the Ovid that they offer now. So I'll be looking at the listings and checking to see what I can order at the bookstore, because there's no sense in when it's something I value this much. There's no sense in waiting for a haphazard find at a used bookstore. But there is one other Penguin Classic of Ovid that I want to show you. It's something that they did for a brief while. I wish they still did it. I wish they had extended the reach of this thing, because it is a brilliant, brilliant idea. I have actually championed the idea on this channel many times when people have asked me, when it comes to this ancient author or that ancient author, what translation should I pick? And my recipe for what you should pick is always the same. First of all, don't take a single name from anybody. It's all about what's comfortable for you, because you're the one who's going to be spending time in this alien world with these alien concepts and voices. So the last thing you want is for the translation to be extra work. So my advice is always go to your library or your bookstore, find as many translations of the target author as possible, and read a bit of each of them, just to see which one appeals to you the most as a reader. Which one is not so much necessarily the easiest to read, but the one most conducive to you, to your reading ear, and go with that. That'll be a fine place to start. And if you don't trust knowing an ancient author through one translation only, which you shouldn't, at least you'll have a grounding then. You'll have an experience with the author, and then you can move on to other translations or to the original. And for a while, Penguin Classics seemed to acknowledge that role and did a great series of books in which they present you with those selections. They're invaluable. They're absolutely invaluable volumes, and this is one of them. The series, this is introduced by Christopher Martin, and it's Ovid in English. And it's many different translators. So you go through a single poem, a single section from a long poem, and you'll get 5 or 6, 3 or 4 different translators from different eras, different schools, to see how they all brought that same thing into English. And Penguin did this for Horace. I did it for Catullus. I think they did it for Virgil. Maybe a couple of other people, but they stopped. And I don't think they make them anymore. And that's a shame, because this is the perfect way to find out. It's not necessarily the perfect way, to read an ancient author, because it's disjointed. And every translator is leaving some things out or enhancing some things in order to at the expense of other things. And of course, you couldn't read a longer work like the Letters from Pontus or the Metamorphoses, God help us. You couldn't read a longer work like this. But this is a good way to know what kind of translation you will like, and maybe even get you a name or two to follow. Almost everybody who's excerpted in here went on to translate more of Ovid or all of Ovid. And this is an excellent way to find that out. You will get, what's an example here? You will get, a single book of the Metamorphoses from one translator and then from many others. That same book. So that you get a sense of all the variations that are possible with this one author. So that's the last Penguin Classic of Ovid that I want to show you, is one that it would be worth your while to go and find. if you're new to Ovid, and if he maybe intimidates you. He shouldn't in English intimidate you. His Latin is unbelievably intimidating. So he is a brilliant poet in the Latin language, working absolutely at the height of his powers. So he's no picnic to translate, but in a good English version, he is not intimidating. He is basically a wry and totally empathetic storyteller. And that is a big chunk of our Daily Penguin, is just a solid block of Ovid that I have, and yet not all the Ovid that Penguin makes. I don't have the love poems. I probably they do a newer version of the Sorrows of Exile that I don't have. I'll have to check into that. But in the meantime, we will move on. And so that's your Daily Penguin for today. We'll move on tomorrow. Thank you, BookTube.